She slammed a notice down on the coffee table before I had even zipped up my funeral coat. The paper hit the wood with the sort of violence I didn't expect at a wake. It landed like an accusation. The room fell quiet. Chairs scraped. Someone coughed. Elena stood in the doorway, composed the way predators rehearse composure, and said it aloud. The house would be seized unless the estate sold immediately to pay supposed back taxes. Then she introduced Julian as my father's secret son, a local cash buyer, willing to rescue us from a public shame he insisted would only grow worse if we delayed. Grief is a blunt instrument. It makes everything raw and slow. But grief is not a substitute for expertise. I had spent my career learning to read paper the way other people read faces. The years of tracing family trees and matching DNA had taught me to look at a document the way a jeweler looks at a diamond. Under the funeral lights, with guests softening into condolences, my hands went to that notice. It felt wrong. Most people would have seen a government heading and the legal-looking type, and that would have been enough. Not me. My fingers told me what my eyes hadn't processed. The paper had the wrong weight, a subtle smoothness for a document that should have carried a watermark. The font had a kerning that didn't match official notices I had handled. The alignment of the header didn't line up with any actual tax assessor documents I knew. Little things, too precise, too polished, like a stage set made to look real. I closed my mouth. I folded the notice along its creases as if it were a letter from a distant aunt, and I sat down. Elena's eyes met mine like she expected me to crumble, to speak, to object, to give her the performance she needed. A scene would serve her plan. My outburst would accelerate it. I had learned long before to separate the personal from the procedural. In that moment of rawness, I made a choice. I would look like a daughter in mourning, but I would not perform the panic she needed. I would not give her the leverage she'd engineered for years. If you're watching this and this is hitting close to home, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It helps to know we're not alone. I stayed quiet for the rest of the service. I let Elena hold the room. I let Julian accept the gentle pats of sympathy, like a man who has rehearsed them. At the graveside, as mourners dispersed into too bright afternoon, I promised myself two things: to grieve my father properly, and to treat the papers laid at my feet like evidence, not pleas. The attic doesn't keep secrets. People do. That evening, while the house still smelled faintly of lilies and coffee from the reception, I climbed into the attic with a flashlight and a pair of gloves. Not because I wanted to snoop, but because I had to document what was there before grief, guilt, or worse, cleanup erased it. The attic was a time capsule, a trunk of military ribbons, my father's work shirts, a school report card with a teacher's looping praise. In the corner, in a rusted tin, I found canceled checks. They were brittle at the edges, their ink running slightly where hands had gripped them for decades. The payees and dates were small domestic things that didn't look remarkable in isolation. A rural clinic in 1995, medical services scribbled in the memo line, repeated payments over months, a postmark that matched the same little town. If I had seen one check, I might have set it aside as clutter. Seeing a pattern, check after check, month after month, was different. Patterns tell stories. The checks were the start of a narrative that Elena had been building for years. She had created a crisis economy in my father's life, small diversions, a steady siphon. Fake invoices arrived at the house for maintenance that was never done. Checks went out to names that were not companies but aliases. A shell LLC surfaced in public filings under the name Heritage Restoration. On its face, it read like a small, respectable outfit that could plausibly bid on estate properties. The registered agent name was a mailbox. The address was a post office box. Julian's name appeared later, connected to a bank routing that took me like a thread through the fabric Elena had woven. I did not go to the police that night. I didn't call a talk show. I had a trade secret I owed to my father and to truth itself. Evidence is persuasive in ways that grief is not. Anger can be dismissed as dramatic. A dossier, documents scanned, dates correlated, handwriting traced, bank routing paths noted, creates a kind of inevitability. If you present the papers correctly, the story they tell is harder to call fiction. I began quietly. Public filings are public for a reason. They put facts on paper. I requested nothing illicit. I worked through county record offices the same way my field requires, formally, respectfully, documented. The LLC filings showed Heritage Restoration formed just 2 years before my father's death. Its principal place of business was an address that matched a mailbox I had seen on the cancelled checks. The names on subsequent invoices matched handwriting samples I had seen in Elena's meticulously curated correspondence. I could say, without sensationalizing, that the pattern of evidence became unmistakable. But patterning isn't proof of motive. It is, however, the map to one. In quiet hours, I combed through mail my father had saved, letters half opened, medical statements, an accountant's note. There were draft letters to a Mr. Alton, a name that recurred, asking for discretion, saying things like, "We cannot afford public exposure." There were invoices attached to receipts that showed work allegedly done on the property, while the work order was blank. One document stood out, a ledger entry matching the dates on the cancelled checks. Another thing that police and courts notice is consistency. Elena's story had been internally consistent in the same way a well-fabricated falsehood must appear. I told myself over and over, do not confront until the case is incontrovertible. Confrontations at the wrong time let the manipulator control the frame. She was a performer. She would look for a stage. I would deny her the audience until law, not fury, spoke. The birth certificate arrived like a courier. I had ordered a long-form copy through the proper channels. Its pages were bureaucratic and blunt, full of official stamps and stamps within stamps, fields completed carefully in handwriting that matched letters I'd seen tied to Elena. The father's name was blank. The mother's name, Elena Vance, was there in crisp black ink. The date of birth aligned with unsettling precision to the period when those cancelled checks were going out. That alignment turned theory into something closer to fact. If those checks coincided with the child's birth, the narrative Elena had presented, the hidden son sprung from a clandestine liaison with my father, became implausible. The timeline fit Elena's life. The ledger fit her narrative about expenses. The LLC fit her financial picture. Julian's paperwork showed up as a late entrant, a figure assigned and then polished. I gathered everything into a dossier, high-resolution scans of the cancelled checks, copies of the long-form birth certificate, the LLC filings, invoices, letters, appointment logs, even a photo of the post office box face. I added my notes, dates, cross-references, a timeline that showed money flowing out of my father's accounts long before his death, invoices that matched no work receipts, and the sudden surprise of Julian's name entering the scene only in the weeks before the funeral. I am not a prosecutor. I'm a daughter and a professional who knows how patterns persuade a jury more than a speech. So I did what the estate's lawyer advised, what a professional would always advise. We let the process do the work. We aligned the documents. We filed affidavits. We set a trap that relied on human error. Those who lie under oath sometimes do so with a pen heavier than their memory. A trap sounds dramatic. It is not a trick. It's a lawful use of procedure. The affidavits we arranged were simple in form, but heavy in consequence. They required a sworn statement about parentage, signed before a notary, under penalty of perjury. In my line of work, perjury is a pressure valve. When the legal system asks for a sworn truth, the consequences for lying are immediate and formal. I knew Elena's performance relied on theatrics and persuasion. She had curated a story that relied on our compassion and on the chaos of mourning. A sworn document would force the illusion from the soft theater of sympathy into the stark fluorescent light of official records. I did not ambush anyone. We advertised a memorial gala, ostensibly a celebration of my father's life. Elena had insisted on hosting it. She wanted the spotlight, the guests, the narrative arc. She planned to use the event to finalize the sale, to tell the room a story that turned her narrative into community consensus. We used the event, legally and transparently, to assemble the witnesses and the notary in one place. On the night of the gala, the house had been cleaned until it gleamed. Silver suits brushed past each other, polished shoes tapped on hardwood, and someone had hired a string quartet that played pieces my father used to hum in the kitchen. It smelled like lemon oil and candle wax. Elena moved through the room like a queen overseeing a coronation. Julian, who had been quiet in public, smiled at the compliments as though they'd been rehearsed applause. I had told only a few close allies what I intended. Megan, my half-sister by marriage, and a quiet presence in all of this, stood at the periphery like a weathered tree. She looked at me with the look of someone too tired to be surprised anymore. The notary arrived. I watched them set their stamp case down with professional precision. A notary's stamp is the kind of thing most people do not notice until it is absent. Then you realize how much we rely on paper's reliability. Elena requested the affidavits. Julian signed. The notary signed. There was a hush of papers sliding across the mahogany table, the small sense of finality that only a pen on a legal form can produce. Then we put evidence where evidence belongs, in the light. I asked quietly if I could show a few items. A projector whirred to life. The room dimmed. Projected on the screen, side by side, were the items that turned a rumor into a narrative you could not deny. Scanned checks with dates, a ledger page with matching invoice numbers, the Heritage Restoration LLC filing, the long-form birth certificate with Elena's name, and the copy of the staged tax notice. I wanted the room to see the pattern as I had, not as an accusation rooted in grief, but as a series of documented facts that fit together. Elena's face, which had been composed into a mask of inevitability, changed. For the first time since this began, she looked like someone who could not control the scene. She began to speak, contradictory fragments like a recording skipping. Julian's smile faltered. Megan looked as if someone had removed her oxygen. It was then that I asked a simple question into the microphone. Did you sign a sworn statement that asserts Julian is my father's son? The room's silence was a physical thing. Elena's voice came out brittle, a practiced script unraveling. She affirmed. Julian affirmed. Their hands had rested on those affidavits. A police officer, who had been on site as a precaution at our request, stepped forward. He spoke in that precise, neutral voice legal professionals cultivate. The room was not a courtroom, he said, but the facts on the screen were being taken as evidence for an investigation. Elena and Julian were asked, politely, to accompany him to a quieter room. They did. They did not resist. They were led into custody on charges related to fraud, perjury, and embezzlement, as the paperwork indicated. It was not a sensational arrest. It was an administrative, procedural consequence of being placed in a position where the state had to respond. People asked if I felt vindicated in that moment. There was a rush, certainly, that comes when truth slides clear and something once opaque becomes transparent. But vindication is not the same as joy. There was sorrow layered under everything. Sorrow for the father whose trust was weaponized, for the years of small betrayals that had gone unremarked, for the way grief had been used as cover. What I felt most clearly was relief. Relief that process, often slow and dull, can protect a memory better than an outburst. Relief that evidence can be more powerful than accusation. Relief that a house that had almost been sold in a panic remained in the family name. The psychology behind what had happened is as important as the paperwork. Manipulation is a slow burn. It is not always dramatic. Abusers do not always scream. Sometimes they speak softly, move small pieces of a life, and wait for the larger structure to collapse in the exact way they planned. Elena had used intermittent reinforcement, kindness one moment, coldness the next, like a slot machine dangling the hope of favor. She had carefully timed moments of generosity and promises of protection so that dependence grew. Gaslighting did the rest, making my father doubt his memory, his accounts, his friends. In that way, the theft was as much psychological as it was financial. I learned to see her pattern. Isolate the person, control the narrative, insert a plausible savior. She was both the architect of the crisis and the ostensible solution. That dual role is the hallmark of many long cons. Create a problem and then sell the remedy. She had rehearsed grief into a commodity. There are practical takeaways here, and I say them not as a how-to manual, but as a map out of a valley I know intimately. Keep records. Keep receipts. Let professionals handle legal and financial review. Don't let shame speed decisions. If a deadline appears suddenly and is attached to fear rather than fact, slow down. Trust the documents before trusting the script someone else offers to perform. And remember, the law is not about revenge. It is about accountability. After the arrests, there was paperwork to file and court dates to attend. There were friends and relatives who asked for details, and others who sat with me in silence and let the house breathe a new air. We pried open drawers and found little things that meant everything. My father's letters to a niece, a recipe scribbled on a napkin, the penciled notches on a doorframe marking childhood growth. Those physical traces of a life are, in the end, what legacy really is. The estate was secured. The house remained in the family. The accounts were subjected to audit. Prosecutors decided to proceed based on the evidence we had assembled. The legal process is not designed for spectacle. It's designed for methodical truce. They would move at their pace, not mine. I celebrated conservatively. The measures we took, dossier, sworn statements, and a public reveal, preserved the family's legal position. They also exposed a truth Elena had tried to bury, that the hidden son was not a reclamation of my father's past, but a constructed key to an inheritance. Megan and I sat in my father's study the night after the gala. The room was quieter than it had been in years. His desk, which had been cleared for the event, now held a single, unredacted photograph of him smiling in a sunlit yard. We poured 2 glasses of wine and didn't do the thing movies make you think you should do. We didn't make tidy speeches. We sat with the silence and let the relief settle into the spaces grief had carved. There will be readers who say this reads like a mystery novel. It does sometimes because life writes us scenes. But the difference between a novel and a legal case is that evidence is merciless in its honesty. A forged document will reveal its flaws under scrutiny. A pattern of payments will show a flow. A signed affidavit under penalty of perjury forces an answer out of ambiguity. You have to be patient enough to let those mechanisms work. I told you earlier that I felt the paper was wrong. That tactile feeling was the first clue. The rest followed because I refused to let emotion dictate my strategy. I refused to perform the kind of grief that would become a weapon for someone else's greed. That is not coldness. It is stewardship. If you are in a place where someone is trying to rush a decision, selling a house in the middle of mourning, pushing a signature, insisting on secrecy, consider pausing and seeking a competent professional, an estate attorney, an accountant, or a forensic document analyst. Do not take this as legal advice. Take it as a plea from someone who walked a path you might be standing at the edge of right now. There is power in process. There is dignity in refusing to be bullied by a script. When the headlines finally came, they were measured. The story in the paper was a factual account. Arrests made after documents indicated a pattern of alleged fraud and perjury. They mentioned charges, not convictions. That distinction matters. Legal systems require proof beyond pattern and motive, and the prosecutors would need to do their work. I would continue to be a witness, not a prosecutor. Those charges did not erase the years of quiet manipulation. They did, however, mark a moment where the state's instruments aligned with the family's truth. The formalities of law, sworn statements, canceled checks, public filings, put a stake in the ground. They allowed me to say that this was not just my perception, but a documented trajectory. I close this story now in the room where it began, the living room where the notice landed. It feels different. The coffee table bears the faint mark of that paper. The scar is small, easily overlooked by anyone who didn't happen to be there that day. But scars are not always things to hide. They are maps that tell where a wound opened and where it has been mended. To anyone who has had a family member's memory weaponized or found themselves gaslit into losing trust in their own records, there is hope. Process can be a salve. Evidence can be rehabilitative. You do not have to carry every burden alone. Reach out to trained professionals. Document what you can without compromising safety or legal boundaries. Lean on people who will not cash your grief in a speech. My father's name is back where it belongs. We restored the estate not to parade a victory, but to protect the dignity he carried in simple things. His notes, his photos, the recipes that tasted like home. Elena and Julian's arrests were the consequence of the document trail she had left in her haste and hubris. I do not relish their fall. I respect the law. I respect the gravity of what had to happen for accountability to take place. If this story resonates with you, please share it with someone who might need the reminder that panic rarely helps, that evidence has its own eloquence, and that patience with principle can save more than a house. It can protect a name. If you have a similar experience or want to talk about recovery from family betrayal, share your story in the comments. Subscribe if you want to be part of a community that supports survivors and truth seekers. We are rebuilding one measured piece of paper at a time.